attack, or 4 people have been arrested as part of a counter-terrorism investigation relating to Iran. That's from the Metropolitan Police. They've arrested 1 Iranian and 3 dual British Iranian nationals on suspicion of assisting a foreign intelligence service. And this is in relation to the suspected surveillance of locations and individuals linked to Jewish communities. Let's speak now to Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, great to have you on. It's been suggested to me that as Iran's military capabilities in the Middle East may begin to dwindle, they then might look to broadening the scope of their attack against the world by using domestic terrorism via various sleeper cells. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, what's interesting about this case, Alex, is that it's actually a long-standing operation that led to its discovery. So what this tells us is what we already know, which is that Iran has been operating these sleeper cells or infiltration cells in the UK for a significant period of time. And I think you're quite right that clearly one method of attack for a regime flailing around on its way to its demise might be to use whatever assets it's got abroad to strike out. But, you know, right now, the real problem is that this has been a long-standing issue in the UK, not merely a recent one.
In terms of the sort of thing that the capabilities that IRGC might have, would they be looking, would you imagine, to potentially targeting military sites, or could they potentially see attacking civilians as a way to broaden the scope of this war?
Well, it could be any of the above, but the terror plots that have been disrupted on UK soil have tended to focus on dissidents or civilians, frequently Jewish community members in the UK. So that might give you a clue as to what what they tend to want to do, which is to cause, indiscriminate terrorism and attempt to therefore scare people that way.
Let's talk about after the regime. Given that one might hope that there won't be much of it left, however long that takes. People keep saying Trump doesn't have a plan, so on and so forth. I kind of think that's a bit of a red herring in terms of who actually ever knows without a crystal ball how things are going to emerge. What do you see might be a future for Iran going forward that could be achievable, and how could that be done?
Well, the bad news is that none of these things are easy things to achieve. So let's imagine that what we might term regime collapse occurs, i.e. the regime is prized out of power. A lot depends on how that happens. If, for example, it is prized out of power because people take to the streets, overwhelming millions come onto the streets and basically force them out, that's one thing. If it's an armed force on the ground, and don't forget, there have been reports the Americans have been arming the Kurds in Iran, that's a sort of another end game entirely. The big issue is that we don't particularly know what would emerge post the collapse of the regime, and ultimately it's for the Iranian people to decide what that looks like. Although I noticed that President Trump suggested he would have a say in the selection of the next Iranian leader. Again, we're not quite sure what that means. Does he mean he's going to support a particular candidate, and throw the weight of the US behind that? Or is it something else that he has in mind? I'm afraid, Alex, there's a lot of unknowns at the moment in this discussion. What we do know, though, is that the regime must go. So order 1 of the day is to remove that regime, and order 2 is to sort out what might happen afterwards.
But that, to me, seems extremely a very normal situation for a war and the collapse of a regime. Nobody really has. If you're a terror state, an oppressive regime, you don't exactly have a democratic system with an opposition party ready to take the reins, and surely it's the case that most countries, when they're entering a conflict, do have a preferred candidate, someone who they know would work with the West, someone who they believe wouldn't inflict the sort of terror attacks and funding of terror proxies as the previous regime has been doing.
I mean, yes, in theory, but you'll recall that the Americans had a preferred candidate for Iraq in 2003. His name was Ahmed Chalabi. Nobody remembers him today because he got nowhere in that sort of mission. But the point is that whoever comes and takes over is going to need legitimacy with the Iranian people, which is why it's right to say the Iranian people are the correct arbiters for the next process in Iran. This is not something that Western powers want or should be taking charge of. That whole era of nation building is over.
How does this affect the anti-Western axis? I was reading a theory that one of the main reasons why America has wanted to go in against Iran is to begin to break that axis up, to prevent Iran from providing deadly weaponry to Russia, and more critically, to prevent Iran being able to supply China with oil and energy that they use to then grow their economies and essentially conduct a sort of predatory mercantilism around the world. Do you see that axis falling apart? Because China's been very limited. It doesn't seem to be running to Iran's aid. Similarly, when Iran turned around to Russia and said, oh, look, we've been giving you all these drones for a long time, give us something back, Putin appears to have just shrugged his shoulders.
Well, Putin's got nothing to give. That's the irony of all this is the Iranians have been using Russian air defense systems, and they were proven to be completely hopeless. So the point is, Putin's actually got nothing to give Russia, to give Iran that's of any use to Iran right now. And Putin is also, of course, tied up in Ukraine. One of the sort of fortunate byproducts of the Ukraine war, which is a terrible war and should never have started, of course, but one of the fortunate byproducts is that the Russians have been unable to interfere anywhere else because they've made such a mess of their Ukrainian invasion. Ukraine's brave resistance has actually helped lots of other people around the world who are trying to fight for their freedom. And on the China front, the Chinese won't intervene because they're not set up in a way to do that. There are no Chinese expeditionary forces that can be sent. Plus, it would, obviously be a tremendous, kind of rupture with the US, and they're not ready for that either. So Iran kind of is on its own. But you're right to suggest that this is a significant breakup of the, the newfound axis of resistance, stroke, old style axis of evil that exists in the world. We saw Venezuela, of course, which was a supplier of oil to this axis as well, being knocked out earlier in the year. Now we have the potential for Iran to be knocked out. This is significant. If we can get regime change to occur in Iran, that is a major strategic game changer, not simply in the Middle East, but globally, because of the alliances Iran has had. And that is something I'm sure that's not been lost on the White House.
Something that's made me cock a curious eyebrow is the potential for there being diversionary disinformation being put out in the public domain. And by this, I mean this weekend, there's apparently going to be a CND protest outside RAF Fairford, now that potentially American bombers might be coming into the US airbase located in Gloucestershire. But also I've been reading, I live down the road from it, and I've got a bit of a weird obsession with military aircraft, that the U-2 spy plane has been seen taking off from RAF Fairford, the Dragon Lady, which is a 60-year-old piece of equipment, for crying out loud. And I'm beginning to wonder whether this is a bit like, look over here, this is where the US bombers are going to be, when actually they're probably not going to be there. They'll be somewhere else that nobody will know about.
Well, people will know where they come from because there are only a limited number of bases they can sort of take off from. But the reality is, Alex, that this is a multifaceted and multi-layered mission. So although U-2 planes are indeed very elderly, as it were, they operate at extremely high altitudes and in no danger of being shot down over Iran. If the technology works, you can use it. There are many different types of aircraft being used in the operation. I mean, the key thing to note is that the Israelis and Americans have achieved total air dominance over Iran's airspace. They can do anything they want, and they can therefore use any airplanes they want, even ones that are, kind of very old. And, you'll see B-52s in operation as well, very elderly planes. But they don't need to worry about being shot down, so they can do that. So I think, you've got different things coming from different parts of the world, different US bases. And the importance is really just to show how impressive this operation is on the part of the Americans and the Israelis, and how it will continue to obviously degrade the Iranian regime.
Yeah, I mean, if one thing's for sure, we saw America using some pretty awesome kit in Venezuela for the removal of Maduro. Finally, as Reform UK's chief advisor on global affairs, if Nigel Farage was the Prime Minister right now, what would you be advising him to do that would be different from what Sir Keir Starmer is currently doing?
Well, Nigel Farage has already told you what he would do that was different. He was on day one saying we should have allowed the Americans to use the bases for whatever they want. Now, note, we're doing defensive stuff, sort of processing at the moment. But he would have been very happy, clearly, for the Americans to use the bases for any particular purpose. So I think the key difference would have been the degree of support given to our allies from day one of this campaign, which would, of course, have avoided the rupture in the special relationship that has occurred because of the appalling and erratic behaviour of this government. And I suppose the second thing that would undoubtedly have been the case is that we would have protected British bases much better. That would have been the key determining factor, and again would have been alive to the realities of what Iran was capable of, which again this government appears to have been caught short in. So clearly we've got a problem right now in that foreign and defence policy in the UK is not being conducted with the interests of national security and national defence foremost in mind. We are seeing worrying gaps and problems.
Would you have recommended potentially even taking an offensive stance, actually joining Israel and America in the initial round of attacks against the regime? Or would you say, no, that's going a step too far?
No, I personally would not have recommended us getting involved initially. This is, firstly, the US and Israel don't need us in this operation, so there was no particular value in our joining it. What I would have advised, though, is that on day one, I would have made it quite clear to the Iranians that were any British bases to be attacked, that there would be retaliatory strikes by British forces. What we're currently seeing, essentially, is that the Iranians are attacking us, and we're then claiming we're doing defensive operations to sort of defend our allies. But what we should have been doing is stating quite clearly, you attack us, we will attack you. It is really very simple. We will use our rights to self-defense in order to actually make sure that you regret attacking British bases. I think that's a fundamentally different piece of advice I would give, and in fact, it's something I've said on the news over the last few days.
Dr. Alan Mendoza, thank you ever so much for joining us today.